The morning air over Tallinn Airport was cool and thin, washed clean by the Baltic. A faint mist hung over the runways, blurring the distant hangars and softening the outlines of the parked aircraft. Mechanics in oil-stained overalls moved with quiet precision, their breath forming brief ghosts in the air. The clock in the dispatch hall showed 8:15 a.m., and the Soviet Tu-124 jet, registration CCP 45021, stood ready for her daily route to Moscow. Captain Alexei Kornev was 42, tall, with a dry expression that could pass for calm even under pressure. To his crew, he was known as Iron Alexei, not for any arrogance, but because his face never gave away fear. He had flown propellers, early jets, even test flights over the Arctic, but he still felt the same ritual tremor every morning, the brief awareness that every takeoff could be the start of something history might remember. He stood at the foot of the air stairs, leather cap tucked under his arm, scanning the fuselage. The aircraft was new, still bearing that faint factory sheen. Sunlight glinted off the metal skin, blinding for an instant. He touched the riveted panel beneath the cockpit window, an old superstition, and whispered, "Let's make it smooth." "Everything checks out, Captain," said Flight Engineer Zadov, appearing beside him with the clipboard. "Hydraulics clean. No leaks. Gear cycles green." "No leaks today," Kornev replied. "Good. Let's keep it that way." The co-pilot, Grigory Likachev, younger by a decade, approached carrying 2 cups of steaming tea. He had that unshakable energy of pilots, still half in love with the machine itself. "Comrade Captain," he said with a grin, "Tallinn weather reports clear all the way. Maybe today will be boring." Kornev took the tea. "Boring flights are the best kind," he said, though a small muscle twitched near his temple, a habit that appeared whenever he didn't believe his own words. In the cabin, Senior Stewardess Raisa Shumskaya moved down the aisle, checking seatbelts, trays, and smiles. She was 33, calm-eyed, the kind of woman who could still a child's panic with a single word. Her uniform was immaculate, the wings on her lapel polished to a mirror. There were 45 passengers that morning. Business travelers, a few families, 2 foreign students returning to Moscow, and a little girl with a notebook on her knees, drawing clouds in blue pencil. Her name was Paulina, 9 years old, traveling with her mother to visit relatives. The engines began their slow, steady whine. Raisa smiled as a vibration settled into her bones. She loved that moment before motion, the second when the aircraft was still tethered to Earth, yet already half airborne in spirit. "Tower, Aeroflot Flight 366 ready for departure." Kornev's voice was steady over the radio. "Flight 366. Cleared for takeoff, runway 08. Good flight, comrades. Cleared 08. "Thank you, Tallinn," said Likachev. The throttles advanced. The jet's twin engines roared with confident rhythm. The runway stretched into white shimmer. At 90 knots, the nose lifted slightly. At 120, the wheels left the ground. The city and its medieval spires fell away beneath them. Inside the cabin, Paulina pressed her nose against the window, whispering, "It's like a silver bird." Raisa smiled. "He's a strong bird. You can trust him." For the first 15 minutes, everything was textbook. The aircraft climbed to the clouds, leveled at 6,000 meters, and turned east toward Leningrad. The Baltic sun spilled gold across the wing. The captain checked gauges, temperatures, fuel flow, all steady. Then, with the softest click, something failed to sound right. "Gear up," said Kornev. "Gear up," echoed Likachev, flipping the lever. 2 green lights indicated the main gear had retracted properly. The third, the nose gear, stayed lit red. Likachev tapped it. "Maybe the sensor?" "Cycle it again." He lowered and raised the lever once more. The red light refused to go dark. Beneath them, the Tu-124's nose gear doors remained stubbornly open. "Hydraulic A pressure?" asked Kornev. "Nominal. Could be the mechanical lock didn't engage. Or the struts jammed." The captain's jaw flexed. "Keep calm. We'll follow procedure." He reached for the emergency checklist. His voice remained even, but the rhythm of the cockpit changed. Each movement now had an echo of caution, as if the air itself had thickened. Talon Control, Flight 366, he transmitted. We have indication nose gear not retracted. Requesting hold to troubleshoot. Flight 366, roger. You're clear to hold over waypoint Delta at 5,000 meters. Understood. The plane began a slow, deliberate circle. Inside the cabin, the passengers noticed nothing unusual, only a gentle turn. Reisa, sensing the subtle shift in tone, adjusted her pace, smiling a bit more than necessary. In the cockpit, they worked through every item on the list. Hydraulic checks, alternate valve, breaker reset. No change. The red light stared back like a small, merciless eye. After 20 minutes, Talon instructed them to continue toward Leningrad, where maintenance facilities were better equipped for such issues. The flight time was short, less than an hour. Talon to 366. Pulkovo Tower has been notified. You are cleared direct to Leningrad. Roger. Proceeding to Leningrad, said Kornev. He clicked off the radio and exhaled slowly. All right, Grigori. Let's stay calm. We'll keep speed moderate to avoid stress on the nose bay. Copy that. I'll watch hydraulic temps. He glanced at the reflection in the windshield. The sky, endless and pale. Somewhere below, the Gulf of Finland stretched like steel. Kornev rubbed his temple again. We'll burn some fuel before approach. No heavy landing. Let's hope for a simple lock issue. But hope was not procedure. Procedure was cold arithmetic. The 124 cruised over the mirror-like sea. To the left, faint contrails drifted westward. Likachev leaned back, eyes scanning the dials. The aircraft flew flawlessly otherwise. Only the red gear light glowed in the corner, a small reminder that perfection could shatter at any time. He broke the silence. You ever notice, Captain, how the calmest flights turn strange near the end? Only to those who talk about it, said Kornev dryly. But there was a smile in his voice. The intercom buzzed. Captain, said Reisa, passengers are calm. One mother asked if we'll land soon. I told her yes, in about half an hour. Good. Keep it that way. The girl's drawing fluttered down the aisle when the aircraft banked slightly. Reisa caught it midair. It showed a silver plane gliding over blue water, with waves drawn like soft feathers. She paused, unsettled by the coincidence, then smiled and tucked it into her pocket. At 9:45 a.m., Pulkovo Approach Control came alive on the frequency. Flight 366, this is Pulkovo. We have you on radar. Confirm you're experiencing nose gear malfunction. Affirmative, replied Kornev. Indication shows incomplete retraction, possible lockjam. We'll need to verify extension before landing. Understood, 366. We'll prepare runway 28 for possible gear-up landing. Emergency services standing by. The word emergency sat heavy in the cockpit air. Even when spoken calmly, it changes how hearts beat. They made their first holding pattern over the city, circling at 1,500 meters. The pilots could see the Neva River snaking below, reflecting the morning light. Smoke rose from factories. Trams crawled through the streets, oblivious. Let's try lowering again, said Kornev. They extended the gear. The main indicators flicked green. The nose light turned briefly amber, then red again. Still negative. Hydraulic B? Stable. They stared at the board, the silence between them louder than the engines. Talon told us she was new, murmured Likachev. Maybe she doesn't know how to misbehave quietly. Kornev gave a thin smile. Let's not teach her new tricks. By 10:05 a.m., the aircraft had been circling for nearly 40 minutes. Each circuit ate into their fuel. The 124's tanks held enough for the route, plus a small reserve, but every minute of indecision narrowed their options. Fuel at 2.8 tons, said Likachev. At this rate, 30 minutes, maybe less. Copy, said Kornev. We'll make one more attempt, then decide. He keyed the radio. Pulkovo, 366. Situation unchanged. We may need to land with nose gear up. Understood. Runway 28 covered with foam. Wind light 030 at 5. Emergency cruise ready. Likachev studied the map spread across his knee. If we have to ditch, the Gulf's too rough. The Neva's smoother, but inside the city. Let's not think of rivers yet, said Kornev quietly. But he looked down all the same. The wide band of water cut through the city like a silver sword. On the ground, dispatcher Igor Levchenko sat in the Pulkovo control room, headphones pressed against his ears. His console flickered with green dots. The one labeled 366 looped in an ever-tightening spiral. He could hear the fatigue in the captain's voice, that subtle dryness that comes when professionals calculate risk in real time. Levchenko leaned closer to the mic. Flight 366. We're monitoring your fuel. Confirm you have sufficient for another 2 circuits? Affirmative, Pulkovo, said Kornev. 2 circuits maximum. Levchenko glanced at the city map, pinned to the wall. The Neva glittered under the sun. A thought crossed his mind, one he wasn't supposed to speak. But rules mean little when lives hang on geometry. 366. For your awareness, there's open water between the Alexander Nevsky and Volodarsky bridges, wide enough for controlled descent. That's reference only. There was a short pause. Thank you, Pulkovo, said the captain. Levchenko exhaled. He knew the crew would understand the subtext. If the engines fail and the runway is out of reach, head for the river. The 124 kept circling above Leningrad. Each turned slightly lower. Through the windshield, the pilots could see the city's domes, the sparkle of the Neva, barges gliding along its surface. Fuel gauges dipped closer to red. Likachev did the math in his head. 200 kilograms a minute. He didn't like the answer. Captain, he said softly, we're close to minimum. I know, said Kornev. Prepare for descent. One more check. He called the cabin. Reisa, inform passengers will be landing soon. No reason for alarm. Standard procedure. Her calm voice filled the cabin a minute later. Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching Leningrad. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated. Everything is under control. Everything. Such a small, comforting lie. Paulina squeezed her mother's hand. Mama, can I draw after we land? Of course, said her mother, smiling faintly. You'll show your uncle the picture. Reisa caught the exchange and felt her throat tighten. She turned away before the passengers could see the moisture in her eyes. Back in the cockpit, the first flicker came at 10:30 a.m. The left engine's fuel flow indicator wavered. A hiccup, a blink, then steady again. Both men stared at it. Did you see? Yeah, might be an air bubble. Seconds later, the needle dropped. The engine coughed once, twice, and went silent. Left engine out, said Likachev. Feather prop. Restart sequence. He flipped the switches. The turbine whined, then refused to catch. Kornev switched focus to the right engine. Still running, but the gauge showed dangerously low fuel. Pulkovo, 366, left engine failure. Descending to 1,200 meters. Copy, 366. You're cleared to land any runway. Negative. We're not aligned. Request vector to 28. Stand by. The right engine sputtered once. Then silence filled the cockpit. A deep, unearthly quiet, broken only by the wind whispering against metal. Both men knew what it meant. The fuel was gone. The 124 had become a glider. The sudden silence inside the cockpit was more terrifying than any explosion. For pilots, engine noise is heartbeat, reassurance, the living pulse of the machine. When it dies, you are left alone with gravity and instinct. Alexei Kornev's first thought was not fear, but mathematics. Altitude 1,200 meters. Speed 340 kilometers per hour. Glide ratio roughly 15-1. That meant 12 kilometers of distance before the aircraft would touch the ground or water. He did not have 12 kilometers of options. Grigory Likachev's hands were already moving over the controls, trimming the elevators, stabilizing the pitch. We're a glider now, he said in a low, almost reverent voice. Both engines dead. Kornev nodded once. Keep the nose steady. Don't let the speed drop below 240. His mind was cutting through possible routes. Try for the airport. Impossible. They were too far east. Try for the fields. No open space wide enough. Try for the Gulf, too distant. Only one silver thread ran below them, the Neva River. Polkovo! This is 366, he called into the radio, his voice steady as steel. Both engines out. We are gliding. We will attempt emergency landing on the Neva River. Repeat, emergency landing on the Neva. The controller's reply came broken by static. Understood, 366. We have visual. Fire and rescue en route along the river. Good luck, comrades. The word luck sounded foreign in the radio hiss. Reisa felt a sudden drop in engine noise before anyone explained it. The cabin became too quiet, as if the world outside had vanished. She walked down the aisle slowly, keeping her smile fixed, whispering, "Everything is all right. We are descending to Leningrad." Some passengers were already clutching armrests. A man whispered prayers under his breath. Paulina, the little girl, looked up at her mother and asked softly, "Why did the birds stop singing?" Her mother had no answer. Outside the windows, the city expanded, roofs and spires gleaming in the summer light. The Neva lay ahead, wide and mercifully calm. Kornev studied its path, searching for the right segment. No bridges too close, no barges crossing. He found it, a stretch between the Alexander Nevsky Bridge and the railway bridge beyond it. The air smelled faintly of fuel vapor leaking through the vents, sharp and bitter. Likachev's knuckles were white on the yoke. "We'll make it," he said, though his voice trembled. "She's light enough." Kornev glanced at the altimeter, 600 meters. Lower the flaps to 20. The hydraulic system groaned, but responded. "Hydraulics holding," said Likachev. "That's something." "Yes," Kornev murmured. "She still wants to live." Down below, on the river, Captain Stepan Ostapenko was steering his tug upstream when he noticed a strange shadow sliding over the water. At first he thought it was a reflection of a cloud, but the shape was too sharp, too fast. He squinted upward and saw the silver fuselage of a jetliner descending silently toward the river, wings level, sunlight flashing off the nose. "By God," he whispered, "they're bringing it down here." He shouted to his crew, "Get the lines ready. Move to mid-channel." No one questioned him. The aircraft crossed the riverbank at less than 100 meters. Trees whipped by in a blur. The pilots could now see individual barges, moored boats, even startled people running along the quay pointing upward. "Brace," said Kornev. "Flaps 40. Speed 270. Keep her level." He felt the stick vibrate faintly as the air thickened with ground effect. The Neva opened beneath them, dark green and smooth like glass. Reisa bent over the nearest row and shouted above the rush of wind, "Heads down. Hold tight. Stay calm." She braced her own arms against the seatbacks. Paulina clutched her drawing book to her chest. At precisely 10:40 a.m., the 124 touched the Neva. The impact was not the violent crash everyone feared. It was more like a long, tearing sigh. The main landing gear sliced the water first, throwing up twin walls of spray. The nose settled gently after them. The aircraft skipped once, twice, like a stone across a pond, before sliding into the river's embrace. A geyser of water burst over the windows. The cabin filled with the roar of rushing current. Some passengers screamed, others prayed. Then, astonishingly, the motion slowed. The jet floated. In the cockpit, both pilots stared forward, breathing hard. The yoke trembled in Kornev's hands. "We're down," said Likachev. "We're actually down." Kornev let out a shaky breath. "And we're still alive." They had landed almost exactly in the middle of the river, between the bridges. The tail was low in the water, but the fuselage remained intact. Through the cockpit glass, they could see crowds gathering on the embankments, pointing, shouting. Within minutes, 2 tugboats changed course toward them. One of them was Ostapenko's. "Cabin crew evacuate," said Kornev into the intercom. Reisa began opening the forward door. Cold air and river spray rushed in. She shouted instructions. "Use the wings, stay together, move carefully." Passengers obeyed, dazed but disciplined. The river was calm enough for them to climb out onto the wings, which floated like wide, silver rafts. Some waved to the boats, coming to help. Ostapenko's tub drew alongside cautiously. "Keep her steady," he shouted to his men. They threw ropes toward the jet. Kornev caught one and tied it around the base of a door handle. The tug's engine strained, pulling the heavy aircraft slowly toward the bank. Water reached halfway up the fuselage, but it held. Paulina was one of the first children lifted onto the tugboat. Her shoes were soaked, her notebook still in her arms. A sailor wrapped her in a blanket. She looked up at the woman who had guided her out, Raisa, and smiled. "He really can swim," the girl said. Raisa laughed through tears. "Yes, he can." Kornev waited until every passenger was off before stepping onto the wing himself. He turned once more toward the cockpit, where sunlight flashed on the wet glass. "Thank you," he whispered, as if the plane could hear. By the time they reached the shore, sirens were echoing through the city. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the embankment, though they were not needed for injuries, only for trembling hands, mild shock, disbelief. Journalists would later call it the miracle on the Neva. For those who lived it, there was nothing miraculous, only skill, courage, and a series of decisions made in seconds. That night, in a small room near the airport, Kornev and Likachev sat silently over mugs of tea. Their uniforms were drying by the radiator. No one had yet written the official report, and perhaps no one ever captured exactly what it felt like in those last minutes above the city. "You know," said Likachev finally, "for a moment, when we touched the water, I thought she'd break apart." Kornev nodded slowly. "So did I," but she held. "And so did we." Raisa entered carrying a blanket around her shoulders. "Everyone's safe," she said softly. "Even the little girl. She wants to send you her picture." She placed a damp drawing on the table. It showed a silver plane floating peacefully on blue waves. Kornev stared at it for a long time. "Keep it," he said. "It's our logbook now." Outside, the Neva flowed past the sleeping city, indifferent yet eternal. The next morning, divers and engineers would begin to recover the aircraft. It would sink partially overnight, pulled down by its own weight, but all souls aboard had already walked away. In the years that followed, the pilots would be commended quietly, without ceremony. The Soviet press preferred modest miracles. For Kornev, the real miracle was simpler. It was a sound that returned when he stepped on the dry ground. The city's heartbeat, the murmur of voices, the distant clang of trams. After the silence of falling, even the noise of ordinary life felt sacred. He looked once toward the river, now calm again, and whispered, "Thank you, Neva." Then he turned and walked toward the hangar lights, already fading in the morning haze. Night fell quietly over Leningrad, but the city did not sleep. The story of the plane on the Neva spread faster than the current itself. By midnight, hundreds had gathered along the embankments, whispering, pointing at the dark outline of the Tu-124 that now rested like a giant, wounded bird tethered to tugboats. Floodlights from rescue crews shimmered on the surface of the river. The silver fuselage glinted faintly under them, half submerged, half defiant. Captain Alexei Kornev stood near the bank, wrapped in a coarse-wool coat someone had given him. His hair was wet, his boots heavy with silt. Yet his mind was still in the cockpit. Every movement of the water felt like another shudder from the aircraft. Grigory Likachev stood beside him, smoking silently, the cigarette trembling slightly between his fingers. They had spoken little since the landing. Words felt too fragile for what had happened. "Do you think she'll hold till morning?" Grigory asked finally, nodding toward the aircraft. Kornev's eyes were fixed on the faint red beacon still blinking at the tail, one last heartbeat of the machine. "She will," he said. "She's stubborn, like everyone who flew her." From behind them came a woman's voice. "Comrades, the committee will see you soon." It was an official from the Ministry of Civil Aviation. She had the crisp tone of someone who must collect facts before dawn. "They need your statements tonight." Kornev nodded, but did not move. "Tell them we'll come after the passengers are settled." At the temporary shelter nearby, Raisa Shumskaya was handing out blankets. The passengers sat in stunned quiet. Some were laughing softly in disbelief. Others just stared at their hands, still smelling faintly of kerosene and river water. The little girl, Paulina, was asleep under her mother's coat, her damp notebook clutched against her chest. When the investigator arrived, broad-shouldered, trench coat dripping, he went straight to the pilots. "Comrade Captain, a remarkable landing," he said, though his tone suggested more curiosity than praise. "But we must understand how it came to this." "Nose gear failure. Yes?" Then both engines stopped. "Yes," said Kornev evenly. "Fuel exhaustion." "Fuel exhaustion?" The man frowned. "You had reserves." "Not when you circle for 40 minutes trying to save an aircraft over city." Grigori cut in. "We did what was necessary to land safely." The investigator studied them for a long moment, then said quietly, "And you did. 45 passengers, 7 crew, not a single casualty." He took a deep breath, as if that realization had only just reached him. "The ministry will need the data, but tonight, rest." He turned to leave, then hesitated. "One question, Captain. Why the river? You could have tried the field beyond Kalpino." Kornev's eyes flicked to the dark ribbon of water. "Because fields of stones, and stones don't forgive mistakes. The river forgave us." By dawn, mist crept low over Neva. The plane still floated, listing slightly. Divers prepared to secure it before it sank deeper. The city trams started their morning routes as if nothing unusual had happened, but every driver slowed near the embankment for a glimpse of the silver shape that had fallen from the sky and lived. A journalist from the local paper approached the pilots. "People are calling it a miracle," she said. "May I quote you?" Kornev shook his head. "Call it skill. Call it teamwork. But not a miracle." Then, after a pause, though perhaps the river had its own reasons. While officials and engineers debated recovery plans, rumors began to swirl. That the pilots had disobeyed orders, that the engines had flamed out due to poor maintenance, that the aircraft might be salvaged and flown again. Kornev ignored them all. He was haunted instead by one question he could not shake. At what moment did I decide the river was the only way? He replayed the seconds in his mind. The silence after the engines died, the way the city stretched below like a map of choices, and how his hands, steady without permission, had turned the yoke toward the Neva before his brain could weigh alternatives. It had not been logic. It had been instinct, sharpened by decades of flying and a promise to bring everyone home. That evening, as the crew gathered in a small canteen near Polkovo, a mechanic burst in, out of breath. "Comrades, they've pulled her closer to the bank. She's still intact." Everyone rose. They hurried outside, and under the dim orange of the streetlights, they saw the plane resting against the quay, water dripping from her wings. Children from nearby buildings were already climbing the embankment fences, pointing excitedly. Raisa stood beside Kornev and whispered, "She looks peaceful, doesn't she?" "Yes," he said softly, as if she found the one runway that was waiting for her all along. Then something caught his eye, a faint movement on the far side of the river. A small boat was drifting, seemingly unmanned, toward the half-sunken tail of the Tu-124. A figure appeared briefly in the fog, silhouetted against the lights. Kornev frowned. "Who's that?" No one answered. The shape vanished behind the fuselage. A minute later, there was a clang of metal on metal, as if someone had opened a hatch. The rescuers shouted, running toward the boat. When they reached it, they found no intruder, only a floating toolbox and a few scattered documents that had somehow slipped from the aircraft. Navigation charts, maintenance logs, a leather flight folder marked USSR 45021. Inside was a single sheet of paper, edges soaked, words still legible. Checklist complete. All systems normal. Kornev stared at it under the floodlight, rain trickling down his face. "Normal," he murmured, "until they weren't." He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his pocket. In the following days, as officials argued over technicalities and the newspapers praised Soviet aviation heroism, something unexplainable lingered in the minds of those who had been there. The people on the embankment swore they had seen the aircraft descend in silence, guided not by luck but by some unseen precision, as if the city itself had bent the wind to spare them. And late at night, when the last of the tugboats had gone and the river lay still, Alexei Kornev often returned alone to the spot where the jet had come to rest. He would stand for a while, listening to the murmur of the current. Somewhere in that steady rhythm, he could almost hear the whisper of turbines that were no longer there, a faint, grateful echo of a machine that had done its duty to the very end. He never told anyone what he heard. Some things, he decided, were better left between the pilot and the river that had saved him. Weeks passed before the 124 was lifted from the Neva. The city had already absorbed the story into legend. The day a jetliner glided down between bridges and spared a city. Yet for the people who had been inside the cabin, the memory was not legend, it was sensation. The sound of water hitting metal, the smell of wet fuel, the sight of the stewardess' calm face when everything else fell away. Captain Kornev returned to duty sooner than anyone expected. He stood again before a different aircraft. Same model, new paint, new registration, and forced his hands to stop trembling as he touched the cold fuselage. Grigory watched him quietly from the stairs. "You don't have to fly yet," he said. "I do," replied Kornev. "If I wait, I'll start thinking about how close it was." They flew a short route to Riga, uneventful, ordinary, almost dull. But every change in engine pitch, at every shift of wind, both men felt the Neva beneath them waiting. Investigators eventually confirmed the sequence. The nose gear mechanism had jammed due to a microscopic crack in the hydraulic valve. The circling had burned more fuel than predicted. Faulty gauge calibration had done the rest. The engines had not betrayed them. Numbers had. The official report concluded with bureaucratic calm. Pilot in command performed controlled emergency landing on water. No casualties. The ministry wanted no spectacle. The Soviet Union preferred triumphs to miracles. Still, in Leningrad, people remembered. Workers on the embankment would point out the spot to visitors. Right there, just beyond the bridge, she came down like a swan. Raisa Shumskaya left aviation a year later. The event had changed her, not with fear, but with a sense that she had already lived her most important hour. She married a river engineer and stayed in Leningrad. Sometimes, on clear evenings, she walked with her husband along the water, tracing the same stretch of river where she had once shouted for passengers to brace. The river looked peaceful, yet she never lost a feeling that beneath its calm surface lived all the moments that had refused to die. Paulina grew up. Decades later, she still kept the drawing. The silver plane on blue water. As an adult, she became an architect. When asked in interviews why she built her design so airy and full of light, she always smiled and said, "Because I learned once that even metal can float if you treat it gently." For Captain Kornev, recognition came quietly. A medal presented in a conference hall, a handshake from a deputy minister, a few lines in Izvestia. What stayed with him was not the decoration, but a letter sent by Paulina's mother. It contained only a short message. "Thank you for giving my daughter back her sky." Years later, during a routine flight to the Caucasus, turbulence struck hard. Passengers gasped. The younger co-pilot froze for a moment, his hand hovering over the throttle. Kornev reached across. Steady as ever. "Don't fight the air," he said. "Listen to it." He guided the aircraft through the chop as smoothly as if he were steering a boat along the Neva. When they landed, the young co-pilot stared at him in awe. "How did you stay so calm?" Kornev smiled faintly. "Once you've landed on water, everything else feels like solid ground." But the river never truly left him. In his later years, he retired to a small dacha near Leningrad. Some evenings, when the wind came from the north, he could smell the same cool scent of wet iron and algae. He would close his eyes and hear again the hush that had fallen when the engines died. He never called it silence. To him it was the sound of decision, the second when life and death balanced on the edge of a wing, and he chose direction. One spring morning, he went back to the city and stood once more by the embankment. The bridges were freshly painted, the water running high with snowmelt. No sign remained of the day that had changed him, only the steady flow of the river. Tourists passed without recognition. He felt no bitterness, only gratitude. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the paper he had kept since that day, the maintenance sheet salvaged from the drifting toolbox, the words blurred but visible, checklist complete, all systems normal. The irony no longer hurt. He smiled and placed the paper into the water. The current caught it, twirled it once, and carried it away. As it floated downstream, he whispered, "All systems normal." It was both a farewell and a prayer. That night, Leningrad slept under thin clouds. On the Neva, barges moved slowly, their lights trembling on the surface. Somewhere, deep under the current, fragments of the old aircraft rested, softened by silt and time. The city had built new bridges since then, and jets flew higher, faster, with instruments no one in 1963 could have imagined. Yet those who knew the story said that sometimes, on quiet mornings, when fog drifts low over the water, a faint hum could be heard above the river, like turbines turning in the mist. Some swear it is only the wind between the bridges. Others believe it is the memory of a crew that refused to fall. In the decades that followed, the story of the landing faded into official archives, a single page in a dusty binder labeled Emergency Incident, Flight 366. But legends are patient things. They live in whispers, in old photographs, in the smell of jet fuel carried by memory. By the 1980s, Captain Alexei Kornev was a white-haired instructor at the aviation school near Pulkovo. His voice had grown slower, but his eyes still carried that unshakable focus of a man who once faced the end and found a way through it. Students gathered around him as he drew diagrams on the chalkboard, describing approach angles and fuel ratios. Most of them had never heard the full story of 1963, only fragments. One winter evening, as snow fell outside the classroom windows, a young cadet raised his hand. "Comrade Captain, is it true you once landed a jet on the river?" Kornev paused, the chalk hovering midair. The students leaned forward. He smiled faintly. "It's true," he said, "but it wasn't bravery. It was arithmetic." He tapped the chalk against the board. Altitude, glide path drag, and knowing when numbers no longer matter. He didn't tell them about the silence in the cockpit or the fear that lived behind discipline. Some truths, he believed, could only be learned mid-descent. After class, one cadet approached him shyly. "Sir, my grandmother was on that flight. She said you never looked afraid." Kornev's expression softened. "Then she was kind to me. Fear was there. I just made sure it followed orders." When he returned home that night, he found a letter waiting, cream-colored, with careful handwriting. The return address read Polina L. Petrova, Architect, Leningrad. He unfolded the page. "Dear Captain, they are building a new bridge across the Neva, not far from where you landed us. I was asked to design the pedestrian platform. I wanted you to know that the curve of the bridge is based on a line of your plane's wings. When people walk across it, I hope they feel the calm you gave us that day. Thank you for teaching me what strength looks like. With respect, Paulina." He read the letter twice, then placed it beside the framed drawing she had once given him as a child. The same plane on blue water, now faded by time. In the spring of 1989, during a training flight, one of his former students experienced an engine failure over the Volga. He followed his old teacher's lessons to the letter: glide ratio, wind direction, calm breathing, and landed safely on a frozen riverbank. When asked later how he managed it, the young pilot simply said, "I remembered his voice. Don't fight the air. Listen to it." That phrase, passed quietly from one generation to another, became part of the school's unofficial creed. No one remembered where it came from. It was simply something pilots said before takeoff. By the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union itself began to collapse, the old heroes of aviation were forgotten among the noise of new politics. Yet on the anniversary of the Neva landing, local reporters still found their way to Kornev's modest apartment. They would bring flowers, a notebook, sometimes a microphone. He would offer tea, tell them a few careful anecdotes, and always finish with the same sentence: "The real story isn't about a plane. It's about keeping faith when everything that holds you up disappears." One gray morning in 1994, neighbors found the door of his apartment ajar. On the table lay an open logbook, a half-finished cup of tea, and a note in his neat, deliberate handwriting. "I'm going for one last flight." He had passed quietly in his sleep, the smile of recognition still on his face. His funeral was simple. A few colleagues, 3 former students, and Raisa, now gray-haired herself. Paulina came too, wearing a dark coat. After the service, she approached Raisa. He never knew. she said softly. The bridge is finished. It was open last year. I called it the flight path. Reisa smiled through tears. He'd have liked that. He always believed that Neva gave us a runway when we'd run out of sky. As they walked away, the river was visible through the trees, calm, endless, carrying its slow whisper toward the Gulf. Years later, tourists in St. Petersburg would cross that same bridge without knowing the story behind its graceful curve. Some evenings, when the wind blew from the east, the metal railing hummed faintly, a low, steady vibration that locals joked was the sound of a plane passing underneath. Few realized how close to truth that joke was. And somewhere beneath the shifting currents of the Neva, under layers of silt and time, small fragments of the Tu-124 still rested. Aluminum, corroded and soft as bone. Each spring, divers found new pieces, tiny, unremarkable shards, and placed them in a small box at the local museum. The label read simply, "Remains of aircraft CCCP 45021, landed on the Neva, August 21st, 1963. Visitors rarely stopped to read it, but sometimes a child would linger in front of the display, tracing the shape of the metal through the glass, eyes wide with wonder, and every now and then one of them would whisper, "It looks like a bird." Far above the city, modern jets roared toward Pulkovo, their light streaking across the night sky. Pilots in those cockpits, relying on computers and satellites, no longer needed to calculate glide paths by heart. Yet in the quiet between transmissions and the hum of descent, some of them swore they could still hear another sound beneath their engines, a faint, steady voice reminding them, "Listen to the air. It will tell you what it wants." And so the river kept its secret. The city kept its legend, and the sky, as always, kept those who dared to trust it. On the 60th anniversary of the landing, the city woke to a cool August morning veiled in fog. The Neva was still, pale and wide, as if waiting for something to return. Across the embankment near the Alexander Nevsky Bridge, a small crowd gathered around a simple memorial stone newly placed by the local aviation museum. It bore only a date and a line of text. August 21st, 1963. They brought the skies safely to the river. Among the people was Polina Petrova, now an older woman with white hair cut short, her hands folded neatly over a cane. The journalist had begged her to speak, to tell the survivor's story. She disliked that word. She preferred to think of herself as a witness, not a relic. When the cameras turned toward her, she looked out over the water instead of at the microphones. "That day," she said quietly, "I learned that courage doesn't shout. It whispers instructions, one after another, until you realize you've lived." Her words drifted across the river, lost in the hum of the morning traffic. Behind her stood several younger pilots in crisp uniforms from Pulkovo. One of them held a wreath shaped like an aircraft wing. Another, barely 30, leaned toward her and whispered, "We study him in training, you know. Captain Kornev. They make us read his report." Paulina smiled. Reports never tell you what the air smelled like that day. When the ceremony ended, she remained on the embankment after everyone had left. The fog began to lift, and sunlight fell through the arches of the bridge. She took a folded sheet from her coat pocket. The same paper she had written to Kornev decades earlier, creased, thin, and fragile. On the back, she had added one new line. "The bridge stands. The water remembers." She released it into the river. The current caught the paper, spinning it slowly before pulling it under the surface. For a moment, the glint of sunlight on water looked like the flash of wings. At that same hour, a flight departed from Tallinn bound for St. Petersburg, the same route the old Tu-124 had flown. The modern jet climbed smoothly through the clouds, engines whispering with effortless precision. The captain, a woman named Irina Sokolova, was tracing the route on her screen when the first officer glanced at the navigation display. "Funny coincidence," he said. "We're crossing the Neva right now, exactly over where that old plane landed in the 60s. My grandfather told me about it." Irina glanced down through the thin layer of haze. The river gleamed like a strip of glass beneath them. "I know the story," she said. "Every pilot here does." The aircraft banked slightly, sunlight flashing off its wings. For a heartbeat, something flickered in the air, A shimmer, a reflection, maybe nothing at all. Yet for those few seconds, the cockpit felt lighter, the instruments steadier, as if the air itself was lending them its calm. Below, on the water, the ripples moved outward in perfect circles. A fisherman looked up from his boat, shading his eyes, and thought he heard the faint hum of another engine behind the roar overhead. A sound softer, older, and impossibly close. He waited, listening. Then, just before the echo faded, he heard a voice carried faintly on the wind, not in words but in tone, even steady, certain. The kind of voice that tells you where the horizon is when the world begins to tilt. He smiled without knowing why. The river flowed on, whispering its endless lesson. Listen to the air. It will tell you what it wants. And as the jet disappeared toward the clouds, the Neva returned to silence, holding, somewhere in its depth, the quiet memory of morning when metal learned to float, and a city learned that miracles sometimes arrive not from the sky, but from the hands that guide it there. That afternoon the city returned to its rhythm. Trams clattered, street vendors sold ice cream, and tourists took photographs of the river without realizing that history flowed beneath it. Yet those who lived by the water still spoke of the old story. Boatmen, tug captains, and ferry operators told it in pieces. How a jet had come down between the bridges, how everyone had lived, how the pilot had stood afterward in silence, watching his aircraft sink like a tired bird. In a small riverside workshop behind the museum, an elderly technician named Mikhail Zatov, son of the engineer who once worked the radio at Pulkovo, was polishing a piece of metal no larger than a dinner plate. It had been found in the mud by divers a year before, a curved fragment of the Tu-124 skin, dull and pitted, but still bearing traces of paint. He cleaned it carefully, humming under his breath. When he held it up to the light, he saw a faint reflection of himself and, for a moment, thought he could hear turbines turning somewhere far away. He carried the piece to the museum director, who examined it and said, "We should mount it next to the memorial window. The children love that display." Mikhail nodded. "It deserves light." He traced his finger along the edge. "My father used to say the metal remembers the air that shaped it." That evening, as the museum closed, he stood at the door and looked across the river. The air had that same stillness his father once described in the flight logs from that morning in 1963. Clear, expectant, a pause before history moved again. Across the city, Polina Petrova sat at her desk near the window, sketching another bridge for a new commission. Her hands were slower now, but the lines she drew were steady and elegant. The television murmured in the background, news about weather, construction, the economy, but she barely heard it. She was tracing the same arc she always returned to, the curve of wings meeting water. A knock came at the door. A young woman stepped in, carrying a folder of plans. "Madame Petrova, I finished the measurements for the river project." Paulina smiled. "Good. Tell me, what did you feel when you stood there?" The assistant hesitated. It was quiet. The air felt safe. "I don't know why." Paulina nodded slowly. "The river remembers." She looked down at her sketch, the pencil hovering above the page. "When you build near the Neva, always listen first. It will tell you how to balance." Night fell, and the city's lights shimmered across the water like a constellation turned upside down. Far upriver, a new jet crossed the sky, its reflection sliding along the surface of the Neva like a ghost of light. In the cockpit, Captain Irina Sokolova was finishing her descent checklist. "Approach speed set," her co-pilot said. "Checklist complete," she replied automatically. Then, after a pause, she added softly, "All systems normal." The words lingered in the small space of the cockpit. She didn't know why she said them out loud. It simply felt right, as if she were answering someone unseen. Down on the riverbank, the wind carried a faint echo of those same words. The old memorial stone gleamed under a street lamp and the letters on its surface. They brought the sky safely to the river. Seemed to catch the light differently for a moment, as if the stone itself was exhaling. Somewhere beyond the bridges, the current shifted. The fragment of metal Mikhail had polished earlier that day now rested behind glass, its surface catching the reflection of passing headlights. In that flicker of light, the dented aluminum shimmered like a living thing. And then the city settled again. The hum of traffic faded. The Neva flowed onto the dark, patient and eternal. Above it, the sky glowed faintly with the promise of dawn. If anyone had been standing on the bridge at that hour, they might have heard it, the soft whisper turbines far below the surface, circling endlessly through the current, not loud, not insistent, just enough to remind anyone listening that once, long ago, courage and precision had turned falling into flight. It was no miracle. It was the sound of people who refused to surrender. At dawn, the river was silver again. Fog clung low to the water, and the first sunlight filtered through like slow music. On the embankment, cleaners swept away the fallen leaves, their brushes whispering against the stone. The Neva never truly slept, and those who worked near it had long learned to sense its moods. That morning, one of the museum guards, Sergei, unlocked the doors early. He liked the quiet before the crowds arrived. The floorboards creaked gently under his boots as he walked through the aviation exhibit, checking the displays. He paused at the small glass case that held the fragment of the Tu-124, its edges catching the dim light. A thin layer of condensation had formed on the inside of the glass overnight. He wiped it away with a cloth and smiled. "Still breathing, are you?" he murmured. From somewhere outside came the faint sound of bells from the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. The guard leaned on his broom, listening. The ringing reminded him of engines starting, distant but steady. He had never told anyone that when the fog was thick and the morning still, he sometimes heard what he thought was a hum above the water, soft, like the beginning of flight. Later, when the museum opened, a group of school children entered with their teacher. They crowded around the case, pressing their fingers to glass. "What's this piece from?" one boy asked. The teacher, a young woman with a voice full of pride, explained, "It's from the plane that landed on the Neva. Everyone survived. It happened long before any of us were born, but it showed what people can do when they don't give up." A smaller child stared at the fragment for a long time. "Did it hurt when it fell?" he asked quietly. The teacher hesitated. "Maybe, but I think the river made it gentle." Outside, Paulina stood on the embankment watching the children through the window. She had taken to visiting the museum every morning now, walking slowly along the river before it became crowded. She no longer carried a cane. She had learned to balance herself by the rhythm of the current. When one of the curators noticed her, he came out and smiled. "Good morning, Mrs. Petrova. Would you like to see the display again?" "Not today," she said softly. "Today I just want to listen." They stood together in silence. Somewhere a gull cried, and a tram bell rang faintly in the distance. "The city forgets quickly," the curator said after a while. Paulina shook her head. "No, it doesn't forget. It just remembers quietly." That evening, far above the river, another plane descended toward Pulkovo. The captain, an older man now near retirement, glanced out his window as they passed over the bridges. "Look," he said to his co-pilot. "That's where the Tu-124 came down. My father used to tell me that story." The younger pilot peered through the clouds. The river looked like a ribbon of light. He said they landed there? In the middle of the city? "Right there," the captain nodded. "No engines, no runway. Just a river in calm hands." The younger man whistled softly. "You think anyone could do that today?" The captain thought for a moment, then smiled. "Maybe, but only if they remembered that machines don't save people, people save each other." The radio crackled, breaking the moment. Flight 432 cleared to land runway 28. "Welcome home." The captain pushed the throttle gently. "Checklist complete," he said out of habit. His co-pilot added, half smiling, "All systems normal." Down below, the Neva reflected their descent lights as they aligned with the runway. Two streaks of brightness gliding parallel to the river's curve. When the plane touched down, the passengers clapped softly, unaware that they had just crossed the same corridor of sky where another flight, 60 years earlier, had taught the city what survival sounded like. That night, the wind shifted north. The river, dark and smooth, carried the faintest echo through its current, a low hum, like turbines idling in eternity. It mingled with the whisper of the bridges and the soft creak of moored boats. If anyone had been awake and listening, they might have heard the rhythm hidden within that sound, a steady, even heartbeat, not of metal or engines, but of something older and truer, the the pulse of a city that once watched a plane fall from the sky, and learned that even in descent there can be grace. And as the first light of morning touched the water, the Neva shimmered, as if remembering once more how the sky had chosen to rest in its arms. A few days later, as autumn deepened, St. Petersburg shifted into that gentle melancholy only the northern cities know. The tourists thinned. The air grew heavy with the smell of rain and stone, and fog began to gather again along the river each evening. Paulina's health had started to fade. Her doctor insisted she stay home, but every afternoon she found her way to the same bench on the embankment. She sat there quietly, wrapped in a gray coat, sketchbook on her knees. The passers-by didn't notice the old woman by the river. To them, she was simply part of the city scenery, like the lampposts or the bridges. One evening, a boy of 10 stopped beside her. He was carrying a model airplane, the kind built from a kit, the glue still fresh on its wings. "Excuse me," he said shyly. "Is it true a real plane once landed here?" Paulina smiled. "Yes, a long time ago." "Did people die?" "No," she said. "That was a miracle. Not that it landed, but that everyone lived." He nodded solemnly, then placed a model plane in her lap. "I made it for school," he said. "You can have it if you want." She touched the little silver fuselage, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll keep it safe." When the boy ran off, she looked at the small toy and felt the years folding in on themselves. The smell of glue became the smell of jet fuel. The river's whisper became the sound of engines losing breath. She saw again the faces of the crew, the quiet courage of the captain, the steady hands that turned disaster into landing. As dusk settled, lights flickered on across the water. Paulina placed the model plane beside her on the bench and whispered, "Rest, little one. You've flown enough for today." She stayed there until the first drops of rain began to fall. At the museum, the night guard made his rounds. The exhibits were silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lamps. When he reached the case with the fragment of the Tu-124, he noticed something unusual. A thin bead of water had formed along the inside of the glass, as though the metal had begun to sweat. He tapped the case gently, and the droplet slid down like a tear. He didn't mention it to anyone. Some things didn't need explaining. Weeks later, Paulina passed away in her sleep, her sketchbook open beside her. On the last page, she had drawn the same familiar shape. Wings stretched over rippled water, a bridge rising beyond it, and beneath it all a line written in careful, fading script. The sky never really leaves the river. Her funeral was small. The architect's colleagues placed flowers at the memorial stone, and one of the pilots from Pulkovo read a few words about balance, precision, and faith. As the service ended, wind moved across the water, lifting the petals into the air. They scattered like tiny, fluttering aircraft, caught briefly in sunlight before drifting down to the surface of the Neva. That evening, a storm rolled in from the Gulf. Rain swept across the city in long, slanted curtains. The bridges rose and fell for passing ships, their lights shimmering on the wet pavement. Inside the museum, thunder rattled the windows, and for a few moments the power flickered out. In the darkness, Mikhailov thought he heard the faint whir of turbines. When the lights returned, the reflection of lightning made the metal fragment shine like a living thing. He stepped closer, laid a hand on the glass, and said quietly, "You can rest now. She's home." Outside, the river swelled with rain. The current carried away fallen leaves, petals, and perhaps, somewhere unseen, a single scrap of paper with the words "All systems normal" still faintly visible. The water took it, folded it into its motion, and bore it toward the sea. And the story continued, told by teachers to students, by pilots to their apprentices, by parents to children who stood on the bridge and asked how a city could turn falling into flight. Each retelling softened the details, but the heart of it remained. A quiet morning, an impossible descent, a handful of steady voices refusing to yield to panic. Even now, on certain fog-bound mornings, fishermen along the Neva claim they can hear a whisper rising from the water, not the wind, not the traffic, but a low, rhythmic murmur that seems to come from beneath the surface, like engines idling, waiting for clearance. They listen, not afraid, until it fades back into silence. Then they cast their lines, watching the ripples widen across the river's skin, and remember that once, long ago, courage had wings, and the Neva had room enough to hold them. Years slipped quietly into decades, and the city changed its name, its skyline, and its rhythm. Glass towers rose beyond the old districts, and new aircraft streaked across the skies, sleek, quiet, efficient, guided more by computers than by human instinct. Yet the Neva kept its slow, ancient pace, winding through St. Petersburg as always had, unbothered by time. Every August 21st, the morning began the same way. A wreath laid on the water, a moment of silence at the small memorial stone, and the low hum of a passing airplane overhead. The city no longer called it a miracle. It was simply part of its memory, a piece of its character, like the bridges, the rain, and the fog. In the museum, the display case stood in its usual corner. The fragment of the Tu-124's fuselage had dulled to the color of river clay, yet under certain light, it still seemed to gleam faintly, as if it kept its own reflection of that day. A new sign had been added beside it. Courage is the quiet art of listening to the world when it stops making sense. One afternoon, a young journalist arrived from Moscow to write a feature for an aviation magazine. He carried a small camera and a notebook full of printed questions. The curator, gray-haired and patient, led him through the exhibit, pointing to the instruments, the logbooks, and finally the small display. Was it really luck? The journalist asked. Or skill? The curator smiled. Skill is the kind of luck that prepares itself for years. He gestured toward a framed photograph hanging nearby. It showed Captain Alexei Kornev standing beside the recovered fuselage, his uniform soaked, his expression unreadable. He never called himself a hero, the curator said. He just said he did the arithmetic. Later, the journalist walked outside to the embankment, the air warm with late summer. He leaned on the railing, watching the slow current slide beneath the bridge. He had grown up with stories of miracles, of courage turned into legend, but something about this river felt more human. Less about glory, more about endurance. He closed his notebook and whispered the old line he had read in the archives. All systems normal. He didn't quite know why he said it aloud, but the words seemed to fit the stillness of the afternoon. A gust of wind moved across the water, and for a moment the surface rippled into the faint shape of wings. That night, long after the museum had closed, the city slept under low clouds. The guard making his rounds stopped again by the glass case. The corridor light flickered, and for the briefest instant the reflection of the metal shard looked like the glint of an airplane window cutting through clouds. He smiled to himself and whispered the same phrase his father used to when checking the exhibits. Listen to the air, it will tell you what it wants. Beyond the walls, the Neva murmured softly, turning under the bridges. It carried lights, echoes, and all the unspoken stories of the city that had grown around it. Somewhere far off, another aircraft crossed the night sky, on approach to Pulkovo, its beacon flashing against clouds. The sound rolled faintly over the rooftops and blended with the breath of the river. If anyone had been awake on the bridge at that hour, they might have looked up and seen that light sliding silently above the water and thought of a long-ago morning when a pilot, a crew, and 45 passengers had trusted the same air and found, within its silence, a way to live. The river kept that silence, the way it keeps reflections and secrets. And when dawn came, spilling pale light across the city, the Neva shimmered again, calm, endless, carrying forward the quiet heartbeat of sky that once came home to rest in its arms. In the years that followed, the city continued to breathe and change, just as the river continued to flow, never hurrying, never stopping. New generations were born who didn't know the names of the pilots or the shape of the old Tu-124, but somehow every child in St. Petersburg knew the story. There was one plane that fell from the sky, and the river caught it. At the small aviation museum, the curators decided to expand the exhibit. They found an old film reel from 1963, black and white footage, showing the rescue boats and a crowd on the embankment. The camera shook as it tried to follow the silver outline of the aircraft drifting in the water. When they played it on a loop in a glass display, visitors would stop and watch without speaking. The images were grainy, silent except for the word projector, yet people said they could almost hear it. The faint sound of turbines winding down, the breath of the city holding itself still. One day, A young cadet from the flight academy visited. He stood before the screen for a long time, arms folded, brow furrowed. When the curator approached, he said quietly, "I'm learning to be a pilot. My grandmother told me this story every year on my birthday. She said she was on that plane." The curator's eyebrows rose. Then she must have been very brave. The cadet nodded. She always said the captain wasn't trying to save himself. He was trying to save the calm. "The calm?" the curator repeated. "Yes." She said, "There's a kind of peace you have to build yourself in the middle of fear. If you can build that, you can survive anything." Later that evening, the cadet walked down to the embankment. He took a small notebook from his jacket and wrote 3 words across the first page: "Never fight air." He closed the notebook, placed his hand on the railing, and whispered into the wind, "I'll remember." As the city lights came alive around him, the surface of Neva reflected them like constellations on the move. He felt the weight of history, not heavy but steady, like a hand on his shoulder, guiding him forward. Years passed again. The memorial stone weathered, moss growing between its carved letters, but people still left flowers. Pilots before their first solo flight, engineers beginning new jobs, children who loved the sound of planes. The river itself seemed to know when it was time to speak. On certain nights, when the wind dropped and the bridges stood still, a faint vibration hummed under the water. Some said it was the current brushing against a metal remains still buried in the mud. Others said it was just the city breathing. But a few, those who had flown or who had lost some of the sky, knew better. They said it was the echo of the moment before impact, the heartbeat that never stopped. One such night, a woman stood alone at the edge of the water. She was in her 40s, a pilot for Aeroflot, returning from a late flight. Her call sign, by coincidence, was the same as the one from 1963, 366. She had read about it only after being assigned the number. At first it unnerved her, but now she found comfort in it. She took off her gloves, placed them on the railing, and looked at the current below. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure to whom. To the crew who had come before? To the air itself? To the city that never let go of its legends? The wind brushed her face. Somewhere upriver, a light blinked once, like a nod. She smiled, put her gloves back on, and walked toward her car. Behind her, the river flowed on dark, immense and alive. It carried reflections of bridges and stars, and somewhere beneath, the last fragment of the aircraft still rested quietly in the silt, their sharp edges worn smooth by decades of motion. The Neva had long ago learned to keep its secrets, but sometimes, when the world above grew too loud, it would let one rise, a whisper against the stones, a hum in the fog, the ghost of engines remembering how to breathe. And if you happen to be walking there at that exact moment, you might feel it, a pulse beneath your feet, as if the earth itself were reminding you that even falling could be a kind of flight, if only you have a hand steady enough and the faith to listen to the air. One autumn morning, the city awoke beneath a low ceiling of clouds. The fog was thick again, curling between bridges, softening the world into shades of silver and gray. On such mornings, St. Petersburg seemed suspended between past and present, between water and sky. By the riverbank, a group of students from the Aviation University gathered for a project. Their instructor, Captain Alexei Kornev, a quiet man with the same sharp jawline and deliberate calm as his grandfather, pointed to the flow of the river below. "Look carefully," he said. "What do you see?" The students exchanged glances. One finally answered, "The current, sir." "More than that," Yuri replied. "You're looking at a lesson. The river never argues with gravity. It moves with it, finds its path, and carries everything home. Remember that when you fly. Control isn't about resistance. It's about understanding what carries you." He let the silence linger a moment before adding, "My grandfather taught that." The students didn't speak. They knew who he was. In the Academy's hall hung a photograph of Captain Alexei Kornev beside the inscription. He brought them home when there was no road left in the sky. After class, Yuri stayed behind, leaning against a railing where his grandfather once stood. The wind was cool and smelled faintly of diesel and rain. He closed his eyes, listening. Somewhere beneath the wind, he thought he heard it again, the hum steady and low, like breath through metal. He smiled. "You're still here, aren't you?" he murmured. "Still watching." A tourist walking past glanced at him curiously, then followed his gaze toward the river, but saw only mist. Later that week, the museum hosted a small evening event for the anniversary of the first passenger jets in the Soviet Union. Among the displays, the old Tu-124 fragment still drew people close. A spotlight cast it in warm light, and next to it stood the plaque with the words "All systems normal." Yuri had been invited to speak. As the lights dimmed, he stepped to the microphone. His voice was low but clear. "My grandfather never talked much about that day," he began. He said the only real miracle was discipline. Everyone did what they were trained to do, and that made it possible to land a jet in a river without losing a single life. But I think there was another kind of miracle, too, the way people remembered, not through monuments or medals, but through listening. He gestured toward the display. "This piece of metal is small, almost nothing, but when you stand near it, you can still feel the story inside it. The sound of the engines fading, the calm voices in the cockpit, the river waiting below. That story doesn't belong to one crew anymore. It belongs to anyone who has ever faced silence and kept going." When he finished, the room was quiet. Then an older woman at the back raised her hand. Her voice trembled slightly. "I was there as a girl. My mother and I sat by the window. I remember the stewardess telling us to hold hands. I still dream of her voice." Yuri bowed his head. "That voice saved you," he said, "and it's still saving people. Every pilot I've ever trained has heard it in some way." After the event, he stayed behind while the others left. He walked up to the glass case, leaned close, and whispered, "You can rest now. We'll keep listening." As he turned to leave, the light flickered, just for a heartbeat, and in the reflection he thought he saw movement. The outline of wings cutting through water, the glint of sunlight on ripples. Then it was gone, leaving only the still metal and the faint echo of the river outside. That night, St. Petersburg was quiet. The fog deepened. The street lamps glowed like moons caught in glass, and the Neva slid silently beneath them all. Somewhere above the clouds, a modern jetliner passed overhead, its lights tracing a steady path east. Inside the cockpit, the autopilot hummed. The captain, lost in thought, glanced at the navigation screen and noticed a waypoint name glowing on the display. Neva 01, a routine fixed point used by every flight approaching from the west. He smiled faintly, as if the sky itself had kept the memory alive. For a long while, the river and the sky moved in perfect parallel, one carrying the city's reflections, the other carrying its echoes. Between them, somewhere in that thin space of air, lived the spirit crew who had once refused to surrender to gravity. And even now, when the wind turned right and the morning mist drifted low over the water, the people of the city swore they could hear it. The faint, steady murmur of turbines gliding just beneath the surface, forever making their final approach. The following spring, the ice broke early. The Neva came alive again, restless and gleaming under the pale northern sun. Meltwater rushed from the countryside, carrying twigs, scraps of leaves, and bits of old ice through the heart of the city. The bridges opened for the first ships of the season, their silhouettes cutting through the morning haze. Captain Alexei Kornev stood on the deck of a training vessel moored not far from the Alexander Nevsky Bridge. He had brought a group of his flight students there for a tradition he'd started years ago, a quiet ritual that wasn't in any syllabus. They each carried a single white paper plane. "When we finish training," he told them, "we throw these into the river, not for luck, but for gratitude. Everything that flies eventually returns to what holds it up." The student smiled uncertainly, but followed his lead. The paper planes drifted through the air, some graceful, some clumsy, before landing on the water and floating away. The current carried them downstream until they disappeared beneath the next bridge. Yuri watched them go, his hands resting on the cold railing. He knew that in a few days the planes would be gone, soaked, folded, lost among reeds. But the act mattered. It was a promise between the living and the memory of those who had taught them how to trust the sky. After the students left, he remained alone. The sun was sinking, gilding the river in gold and rose. In that glow, he thought he saw a shimmer on the surface, like the curved shadow of wings passing just beneath the water. It was gone a moment later, but it left him smiling. He whispered the words that had been passed down through his family and through his grandfather's students. Listen to the air. It will tell you what it wants. That same evening, far downriver where the Neva widened toward the Gulf, a fisherman sat in his small wooden boat. He had fished these waters for 30 years, knew every turn of the current, every quirk of the weather. But that night, as twilight deepened, he heard something he couldn't place, a faint vibration, like the echo of engines idling far beneath him. He leaned over the side, listening. The sound grew clearer for a few seconds, a slow, rhythmic hum that seemed to move with the current, and then faded again. The fisherman smiled, shaking his head. "Old ghosts," he muttered, still flying under the water. He cast his net, and when he hauled it up, he found among the wriggling fish a small, corroded piece of aluminum, thin, curved, and drilled with rivet holes. It glinted briefly before dulling in the evening light. He turned it in his hand, then carefully placed it on the floor of his boat. The next morning, he brought it to the museum. The curator, older now, took the fragment gently. "You found it near the Gulf?" The fisherman nodded. "Then the river is still giving them back," the curator said softly. They added the piece to the same display. Beneath the glass, the fragments from different decades now lay together, some dull, some still shining faintly, all carrying traces of the Neva's long memory. That night, a gentle rain began to fall over the city. Lights blurred on the wet streets. From the bridges, the reflections looked like constellations trembling in the water. In one apartment near the embankment, an old tape recorder clicked on, a recording the museum had restored from the archives. The voice was faint but steady, carrying through decades of static. "This is Captain Kornev. Both engines out. Attempting emergency landing on the Neva River. Passengers calm. We will try." The tape ended abruptly. Silence filled the room, soft but alive. The curator stood listening, eyes closed, as the rain tapped gently against the windows. Then, from somewhere deep within the city, a plane's engines roared overhead. The sound was smooth, confident, alive. He smiled. "Still flying," he whispered. And so the years went on. The story became part of the city's bloodstream. It wasn't carved into marble or taught in school books, yet everyone who lived near the Neva seemed to know it by heart. They told it in cafes, in classrooms, in quiet conversations on foggy mornings. There was a plane once, they would say, that forgot how to stay in the sky, and a river that remembered how to hold it. When the wind was right, the river still answered, its murmur rising through the mist, blending with the sounds of modern life, carrying forward the unending rhythm of water and air, of falling and rising, of courage and calm. And in that quiet song, if one listened closely, the words could almost be heard again. "Checklist complete. All systems normal. Listen to the air. It will tell you what it wants." By the time another decade folded into the river's current, the memory of a landing had become a quiet inheritance. Captain Yuri Kornev's lectures about listening to the air turned into a training module at the academy, though the students rarely realized that his calm voice carried the same inflection his grandfather's recorder once had. Every August, Yuri still led the young pilots to the embankment. They stood in a semicircle, uniforms crisp, the air smelling faintly of jet fuel drifting from Pulkovo. He never gave speeches. He would simply nod toward the water and say, "It's still there. Remember that the sky has hands." After the ceremony, he always lingered, waiting until the students' voices disappeared into the hum of the city. Then he'd take a thin notebook from his pocket, its cover worn smooth from years of use, and open to the last page. There were only 3 lines written there, copied in his grandfather's precise handwriting. "Checklist complete. All systems normal. Listen to the air." He touched the paper, then closed the book. The wind off the Neva rose just enough to stir his hair, as if an acknowledgement. That evening, when the fog began to settle again, the water carried faint rings that spread from the center of the channel. To anyone else they were just ripples, but Yuri saw their pattern, perfect circles widening outward, like the echo of turbines turning in the deep. He stood watching until the last ring merged with the rest of the river. Far above, a jet's navigation lights blinked red and white against the clouds. For a few seconds, they lined up exactly with the reflection of the street lamps on the water. Two paths, one of air and one of current, running parallel for the heart of the city. The Neva would always hold them both. Epilogue, the river and the sky. The night before another August 21st. St. Petersburg glowed softly beneath a ceiling of clouds. The bridges stood open, the water below them dark and full of light. In the stillness, the Neva looked almost motionless, as though waiting once again for wings to touch it. Captain Yuri Kornev left the academy late that evening, his hands still smelling faintly of oil and paper. He walked through the quiet streets until he reached the memorial stone. The rain had just stopped. Droplets slid down the carved letters like tears. He placed a small brass pin, his grandfather's pilot badge, on the stone. For a while, he stood without moving. The hum of the city around him was low and steady, almost like breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper meant only for the river. "You kept your promise," he said, "and so will we." He looked up. Far beyond the clouds, an aircraft crossed unseen, but its sound rolled gently through the night, the kind of sound that lives in bones rather than ears. He smiled, knowing that someone up there was gliding safely toward the lights of Pulkovo, following a path that passed, as always, above this very stretch of water. Across the river, in a museum window, the fragment of the Tu-124 reflected the street lamps. The guard on duty thought he saw it shimmer, as if for an instant the metal remembered sunlight and motion. He turned off the lights, locked the doors, and left a faint reflection behind. The wind rose from the Gulf, cool and clean. It slid along the embankment, touched the badge on the stone, and rippled outward over the water. Circles spread across the surface, widening until they vanished into the darkness. Yuri watched until the last ripple disappeared. Then he turned and walked back toward the city lights, leaving the river behind, or perhaps carrying it with him. Long after he was gone, the Neva kept whispering. Those who lived near it said the sound was only wine to the bridges. But on quiet nights, if you listened carefully, you could hear words inside the murmur, not loud, not clear, but certain. Checklist complete. All systems normal. Listen to the air. And somewhere above the clouds, another aircraft leveled its wings and began its descent, the sky opening like a memory. The lights of St. Petersburg rose to meet it, shining along the curve of the river, the same river that once caught a falling plane and taught a city that even in descent there can be grace. The water and the sky moved together, forever intertwined, carrying the same quiet truth forward through time. That courage does not roar. It simply keeps its course. And the Neva, eternal and patient, flowed on, still holding the reflection of wings. By dawn, the city had begun to stir again. Trams clanged awake, the smell of coffee drifted from corner cafes, and the first rays of light stretched over the Neva, washing the bridges in gold. The river looked tranquil, but under the surface it moved with purpose, carrying silt reflections and secrets toward the Gulf. A janitor sweeping near the memorial stone noticed the brass pilot's badge still resting there. It gleamed faintly in the morning light. He hesitated, then placed it gently in his pocket. Later that day, he would bring it to the museum. He didn't know its story, but somehow it felt like it belonged there. Inside the museum, the curator prepared the new exhibit panel. The heading read simply, "Legacy of Flight 366. Beneath it were photographs of the original crew, a section of the Tu-124's cockpit glass, and a display card describing how a city once held its breath for 45 strangers and their pilots. Visitors began arriving as the doors opened. Among them was a mother with her little son. No older than Paulina had been that day in 1963. He tugged at her sleeve, pointing to the small piece of fuselage under glass. "Mama," he whispered, "this one really flew?" "It did," she said. He frowned thoughtfully. "And it didn't break?" "No," she said after a pause. "It listened." Later that afternoon, Captain Yuri Kornev returned to the academy. His students were running simulations, sleek digital recreations of storms, malfunctions, emergencies. He watched them from the doorway, remembering the heavy instruments of his grandfather's cockpit, the smell of metal and smoke. When one of the trainees looked up and called, "Captain, what do we do when a computer freezes mid-descent?" Yuri answered without thinking, "You listen, the air will tell you what to do." The students chuckled softly, assuming it was a metaphor, and went back to their controls. But Yuri stood for a moment longer, hearing something beyond the hum of the computers, an echo calm and familiar, like the whisper of turbines through mist. That evening, he visited the river once more. The wind had died down, and the Neva mirrored the sky so perfectly that horizon and water were indistinguishable. For a long moment, he felt as though the city were floating, a vessel carried by air and memory alike. He opened his grandfather's notebook and tore out the final page. On it were the same 3 lines that had followed his family through generations. He folded the paper neatly and released it into the river. It drifted, caught a glint of light, and began to sink slowly, the ink dissolving into the current. The sky above was silent. Then, faintly, from somewhere far to the east, came the sound of an approaching aircraft. The hum grew, softened, and faded again as the plane passed overhead, its reflection gliding across the water like a memory returning home. Yuri watched until both sound and light were gone. Then he turned to leave, the river behind him whispering one last time, soft, endless, certain. And if someone had been walking the embankment then, they might have thought they heard it too, the voice of the Neva, old and gentle, repeating the lesson it had carried for 60 years. That courage can be quiet. That calm can save lives. And that sometimes, when all else fails, the sky will find its way back to the water, and the water will lift it home. When night returned, St. Petersburg sank again into its soft hum. Cars tracing light across bridges, the river whispering beneath them. The museum's windows glowed faintly from the street lamps, and inside, the new display stood finished. The curator had placed the pilot's badge that the janitor found beside the fuselage fragment. The 2 pieces, metal once carried by air, now joined by water and time, seemed to belong together. He turned off the lights and left only one lamp burning above the glass case. Its reflection touched the ceiling like a small, steady star. Outside, the fog crept in from the gulf. The city blurred, the air cool and heavy with the smell of rain. The Neva widened, swallowing the echoes of footsteps, trams, and distant church bells. Somewhere between the bridges, a tugboat's horn moaned, a sound so low and resonant that it seemed to rise not from a river, but from memory itself. Far from the city center, at the edge of the gulf, the water met the sky in an invisible line. There, beneath the surface, lay what was left of Flight 366, ribs of metal, twisted cables, a shape smoothed by decades of current. Fish darted through the open frames. Barnacles clung to the rivets. To the sea, it was no longer wreckage. It was reef, a quiet anchor of the past. Sometimes divers went there on calm days. They said it was peaceful, that even in the dark they felt safe, as if the water itself carried a memory of calm hands and quiet voices guiding it down. One diver once described hearing something strange when he reached the deepest section, near what had once been the cockpit. Through his helmet he felt a vibration, rhythmic and almost warm, like the distant thrum of engines. When he surfaced and told the others, they laughed and called it imagination, but he swore the sound was real, repeating softly in the water until it merged with his own heartbeat. Years later, Yuri retired from the academy. On his last day, he stood at the lecture hall window while his students packed their things. "Remember," he said, his voice steady but low, "checklists and machines will change, but the air won't. Listen to it. It's older than any of us." He left the classroom, walked down the empty corridor, and felt the familiar vibration of a plane passing overhead. He looked up through the skylight, 2 points of light crossing the clouds, and smiled. At home, he placed his grandfather's logbook, now worn to softness, inside a drawer. He didn't lock it. He wanted whoever found it next to open it easily. On the front cover, he wrote a single sentence: "The river and the sky are never far apart." That night, a gentle wind swept through the open window. The curtains moved as if stirred by passing wings. The Neva flowed on. It had seen generations come and go, cities rename themselves, and bridges rebuilt, but its current never changed. It still shimmered with the memory of a morning when the sky had fallen and learned to float. And though the people of St. Petersburg no longer spoke of Flight 366 every day, the story lived quietly in the way they looked at the river, always with a kind of trust. On foggy dawns, when the water and sky became one color, bargemen sometimes claimed they saw a pale shape gliding beneath the surface, a long, silver silhouette that moved without sound, leaving only ripples. No one could prove it. No one tried. Because in a city that has watched the impossible descend and survive, faith doesn't need evidence. It only needs a whisper that rises from the Neva whenever the world goes silent. Checklist complete. All systems normal. Listen to the air. And then the river, as always, keeps flowing, patient, eternal, carrying the reflection of wings home to the sea. Spring came again. The air over St. Petersburg was filled with that thin, trembling light that makes the whole city look like a reflection. The Neva loosened from the ice and began to speak again, first with cracks and sighs, then with the soft, confident rush of water finding its old rhythm. At dawn, mist rose from the surface and drifted across the bridges. From a distance, it looked like a cloud landing on the city. A boy and his grandfather walked along the embankment, the older man carrying a folded newspaper, the boy a small toy glider. "Can I throw it from the bridge?" the boy asked. "If the wind's right," the man said, "the Neva will catch it." They stopped at the same spot where the memorial stone stood. The man read the inscription quietly, his voice rough with age. They brought the skies safely to the river. He set the paper glider on the railing. "Now," he said, "let's see if the river still remembers." The boy let go. The tiny plane dipped, tilted, and then leveled out, sailing on a pocket of air before landing gently on the water. It floated there, spinning once, then drifted downstream. The boy grinned. It didn't sink. "Nothing that listens ever sinks," the man replied. They watched until the little plane vanished beneath the bridge. The boy slipped his hand into his grandfather's, and they walked on, the sound of the river following them like a quiet applause. That afternoon, sunlight reached through the museum windows and pooled around the glass case. The fragments of the two, 124 shone faintly as if they had absorbed the day's warmth. The curator, now white-haired and slow, adjusted the small brass badge beside them and smiled. He had stopped telling visitors the story in full. He preferred to let them find it themselves. Some noticed the shape of the old wings and the reflections on the ceiling. Some only felt the hush in the room, the kind of hush that belongs to both water and sky. Outside, the river glittered. A gust of wind passed through the open window and stirred the pages of the guest book on the counter. It flipped to a fresh page. A single line appeared, written by an anonymous visitor in careful script. "The Neva still carries them." The curator looked at it, nodded once, and didn't close the book. As evening settled, the city lights came on one by one. From above, St. Petersburg looked like a constellation laid across a river of glass. A passenger jet descended through thin clouds, engines humming steadily. In the cockpit, the captain checked his instruments, then glanced out the side window. "See that stretch of water?" he said to his co-pilot. "That's the Neva. My father used to tell me a story about a plane that landed there." The younger pilot smiled. "I've heard it. Every captain here knows it." The older man nodded. "Good. Then we remember the right things." Below them, the water reflected the blinking lights of the aircraft, two red dots sliding silently across the surface. For a heartbeat, the reflection seemed to keep moving even after the plane had passed, as if the river itself were finishing the motion. When night deepened and the bridges began to lift, the Neva stretched wide and quiet. The moon laid a white path across it, the kind of light that once guided a falling jet to safety. The current whispered against the stone, the same rhythm it had kept for 60 years. Somewhere in that murmur was a voice, calm and distant, all systems normal. Listen to the air. And then, as always, the river answered with the only word it ever knew, its endless, patient song of movement, carrying the sound of wings, the echo of courage, and the heartbeat of a city that learned long ago that even in descent there can be grace. The next morning, sunlight poured across the water like a slow awakening. The Neva shimmered under a pale sky, calm and clear, as if every ripple were a heartbeat returning home. Boats drifted lazily between the bridges, their wakes dissolving into the same channel where a silver jet had once touched down so long ago. The city had already moved on, new people, new streets, new voices. Yet something in the air still carried the rhythm of that morning in 1963. It lived not in books or monuments, but in the quiet understanding that courage doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply holds a course, steady against gravity and fear. At the museum, the lights came on. The fragment of the two, 124, caught the first reflection of the day. The curator placed a small note beside it, written in clean, deliberate letters. There are no endings in the air, only landings. He stepped back, satisfied, and watched the sunlight move across the glass until the metal glowed like a living thing. Outside, the river whispered against a stone embankment. A soft wind lifted from the Gulf, threading through the city, brushing against faces, carrying with it a sound too faint to name. Part memory, part breath, part echo of turbines that once trusted the air. Above the city, another aircraft banked gently toward Pulkovo. Its landing lights flickered across the water. And for a moment, the reflection looked exactly like the one from 60 years before. The Neva accepted it without surprise, as if recognizing an old friend. Then the sound faded, and all that remained was the river, the sky, and the steady pulse between them. And in that silence, St. Petersburg, the city of water and air, kept its oldest promise, to remember those who once fell, and to lift them forever.